Mike Barber is Professor Emeritus at St. Louis University. He's published numerous books and more articles than I can count on the phenomenology of the social world, the philosophy of religious experience, finite provinces of meaning, ethics, philosophy and race, the work of Alfred Schutz, Emmanuel Levinas. Are there things you haven't published on? It's just a lot. And he's also a really genuinely warm, kind, calm, thoughtful human being. So if you haven't spent time with Mike, I think you should. After, and Mike and Martin take your own questions, I'm assuming, after you go. Martin, Nietzsche is chair of the Department of Contemporary Continental Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. His claim to knowing Husserl is much larger than many of ours, because that's where Husserl began, right, as a human being. So Martin's closest. His research focuses on phenomenology, phenomenological topology, philosophy of art, aesthetics, phenomenology of religious experience, and resilience theory. This I need to know more about. Nietzsche formulated the transitive topological model of phenomenology in his book published in 2018, which I've read, and I think it's a phenomenal book. And he's co-authored Phenomenological Investigations of Sonic Environments, and also edited a volume on image that was, I thought, also quite good. He's connected to all the serious people in phenomenology in Europe, and also the less serious people in phenomenology in the United States. So he's really also a very, very warm, nice human being, and he can lead us anywhere in Pittsburgh, or I'm convinced any other city. He doesn't just write on topology because he's interested in it. He actually navigates really well. Although yesterday or the day before, when he was taking us around, and we're like, how do we get back? I'll lead you. And then he pointed up, and we saw the neon lights of the Marriott Hotel. I'm like, oh, you've been following neon lights. Anyway, Martin also is someone who's really worthwhile to spend time with and engage with. And I'm really glad to hear both of your papers. So welcome, everyone, and let's give a round of applause for our speakers.
Okay, I'd like to thank Peter for the introduction. I'd like to thank Olga for organizing this. I'd like to thank Jeff for all of his generous service and getting this conference going. Jeff's enormously generous. I've seen him through all kinds of phenomenological societies meeting here at Duquesne because of his generosity. So I've changed my topic title a little bit. It's called The Object of Religious Experience, Provinces of Meaning, Theoretical Anonymity, and Generative Phenomenology. I will, what I'm going to do is try to talk through a PowerPoint, and then at occasions go through a little reading of some stuff that fills out the PowerPoint. So don't want that. Okay. So the first part I want to talk about is regional ontology in the finite province of meaning of religious experience. Regional ontology is, of course, a Husserlian term. What I'm really trying to do here is say that the divine could be a possible object of research and knowledge, right? Husserl argues that there are certain kinds of things that are not visible. We have categorical intuitions that have objects that are not visible. Essences, I quote here from the Gibson translation: "We permit no authority to deprive us of the right of recognizing all kinds of intuition as equally valuable sources for the justification of knowledge, not even that of the modern natural science." So these are possible objects of investigation. And also, I think Husserl's really got the idea that first you have to talk about what's the eidos and then what's the appropriate methodology. So if you're taking an empirical scientific methodology and you want to investigate God, it's not going to work in a sense. Okay. In the Grenzprobleme, he does say this: reason does not conflict with religious experience, with revelation, insofar as it is experienced as seen as an originary, intuitive, evident certainty. So Husserl seems to suggest in the Grenzprobleme that there is a kind of intuition of the object of religious experience, which would be God. And also, and especially in the later works, he does try to situate religious experience in the everyday life world. I mean, he's very clear that some of the writings I'm going to use around the time of the crisis, that religious experience is one of those cultural practices like music, like painting, like art, which is interesting because that is also kind of one of the things I've developed is following Alfred Schutz. I've tried to develop the idea of religious experience as a finite province of meaning. Music is a finite province of meaning. Art, play, all kinds of literature, reading a book is part of a finite province of meaning. So this puts religious experience in that context, I think. And all his notions of the finite provinces of meaning is part of an extension of his phenomenological psychology, which is the phenomenology of the social world. And he lays out 6 features of a cognitive style for provinces of meaning, one of which is an epo-ché, which kind of puts you in the attitude. For instance, in religious experience, I think it would be candles, music, incense, temples, the special day of the year, it's the New Year's Day or Passover, and then you're in a different kind of realm. There's a form of spontaneity, that is to say, in everyday life, the form of spontaneity is work and pragmatic engagement with the world. And the thing that you're aiming at in that kind of pragmatic sphere is your ultimate pragmatic goal, whatever that is. That's the object of the form of spontaneity. For the religious experience realm, I think the object, there's a different kind of form of spontaneity than in pragmatic everyday life. The object would be ultimate reality or your ultimate relevance. There's also a tension of consciousness in everyday life. So Schutz's finite provinces of meaning are contrasting pragmatic everyday life with these other different kinds of provinces. So the tension of consciousness in everyday life, it's what he calls wide awakeness, where you're following Bergson here. It's why you're kind of trying to master the world and wide awakeness. But then in the form of in the tension of consciousness of religious experience, it's more relaxed. It's not focused on pragmatic mastery. There's such things as passivity through rapid flowing representational sequences where you see a window refers you to a plant, it refers you to a tree, which refers you to the idea of God or something like that. Jonathan Edwards has descriptions like that. Schutz talks about the case with Jacob and his ladder, where all of a sudden he falls asleep. He's in a dream, which is a different province of meaning. And the stone becomes a pillow, becomes a pillar, becomes God's house. It's just a series of representational representations, all representing God in some sense. But there's also a tension of consciousness, I think, in quiet contemplation, things like that. So different tensions of consciousness, but it's not pragmatic mastery. Experience of self, there's a role, there's temporality. Inner time tends to be emphasized over outer time in religious experience. And there's highlighted times like New Year, Passover, Sabbath. Time itself is important here. And sociality, a particular kind of social kinds of relationships in each province of meaning. I talk about here solitude or ritual. These are different dimensions, different types of sociality. I do think Schutz emphasizes the subjective noetic side. And so he's more focused, he's not too focused on what the ultimate reality is, I would say, in my interpretation of what he means by the finite province of meaning of religious experience. Schutz has said that, by the way, that is a province. He never developed the idea of religious experience. I've tried to do that a little bit. So, but he emphasizes the subjective noetic side, not what is ultimate reality, but how we configure actions and processes in relationship to it. And that's actually a quote kind of from Gurvich. Gurvich criticizes Schutz. He thinks he's too focused on the subjective side and not enough on the objective side. In religious experience, well, I just want to suggest that maybe that when I talk about religious experience, is really the object of the form of spontaneity is not that central an issue for Schutz, right? It really is how we react toward that object that's more important. Okay, so so what I've done is really sort of, I hope, given an idea that I'd go from Husserl with his idea of God as a possible object to the finite province of meaning of religious experience, where the object is located as that to which the form of spontaneity is ordered. Now, what I want to do now is just talk about personalistic theism. And I want to talk about Mark Shaler, and Anthony Steinbach. Both are kind of connected with each other. I think they're both working in the Shaler tradition in a way. The point I want to make here is it does make a difference what the object is of religious experience in this sense, that for them, if this object is a personal being and it's part of a personal relationship, that radically shapes what the finite province of meaning of religious experience is going to be like. So the object of the form and put object, because it's actually a subject here, really, a form of spontaneity, God as a person, reshapes the finite province of meaning. Shaler has an interesting comment on James. He says, James, he called it, never one of them minces his words, Shaler did, because he talks about James' worm-eaten pragmatism, which is aimed, he says, at the happy issue of convictions in practical life, one's psychological contentment. The point James seems to be talking about of religion is that it makes you happy and content and well-being. But Shaler wants to say, no, if it's a person, right? This discussion that James has ignores that fundamental fact that you're dealing with a person. That'll affect all kinds of things about how religious experience is undergone. And even to follow that, Shaler gives you a whole Wissenschaftslehre. He talks about natural or positive revelation. Actually, there's kind of a genetic phenomenology here, a generative one, in that he thinks natural revelation precedes positive religion. People would look at nature and see the revelation of God, but way before you get into positive revelation. But all of those two kinds of revelation are distinct from theory. Natural theology, which he says never convinced anyone that God exists. The proofs for God's existence have never done that. Metaphysics, theology, and philosophy. His own philosophy, he says, leads one only to the threshold of a revelation. It does not, it's a thinking about revelation. It's a thinking about religious experience. It's not itself a religious experience. It's a thinking about it. And here's the difference, I think, revelation, the object, God as personal, again, from nature, he says, holy, intelligent, infinite, free, and loving. So the result is the knowledge of God in the revelation, in religious experience, is not through spontaneous efforts. Knowledge of God is from God as the revelation of a free person. And that God is absolute in a value sphere also of de-idolization. And he also notices, by the way, that as you go up that value scheme ranking, you get less and less control. At the first level, we have a lot of pragmatic masters. You go up, you can't control bliss. You can't make certain things happen at that level. So what you can see here is that actually, if God is personal, right? Now you're going to be emphasizing revelation, right? And not knowing and how we achieve this on our own, right? So that's why I find this very interesting, that the whole idea of value ranking, the whole idea of Wissenschaftslehre, where you distinguish the revelation experience from thinking about religious experience. The focus has to be on God, engagement with a person, not simply being happy. There's a distinctive religious act, and not only that, but you've got a distinctive religious act that's correlative to the object as a phenomenologist, correlative to the object, disposed for and concerned with a possible reception. Oh no, there we go. A possible reception, awaiting the free revelation of the person of God. So not only does he do all this stuff with God as a personal object, but the act itself is a disposition to receive a revelation from a person, okay? So even the very religious act itself gets defined in relation to the object. I'm just trying to indicate how you construe that object does affect the whole idea of a finite province of meaning. And that, I won't necessarily say that damages what Schutz says, it just makes it quite distinctive, okay? And that religious act is awaiting the free revelation of the person of God. It is not, therefore, a projection of needs and fantasies. So people will say, well, religious experience is meant to be fantasizing God. No, he's going to say it's the act is ordered to a reception. It's not me doing something like producing fantasies. So this act and object then is described in what he calls the essential phenomenology of religious experience. Steinbach, in the same way, talks about phenomenology and mysticism in his book, that is. His evidences are the accounts by the mystics themselves in the Abrahamic religions, Teresa of Avila, Rabbi Dov Ber, Ruz Bihaim, Bakli, from Islam, and he contrasts this approach from Shaler's theorizing about the nature of God. So in other words, one way of going about trying to get at religious experience is to look at the accounts of mystics. That's one way to do it. Another way is to, like Shaler, theorize about the whole idea of God. Steinbach, as he says, he teases out the philosophical implications of these accounts. He discovers a distinctive verticality, God as personal mystery to be revered, not the mystic's own achievements, versus a matter of horizontal pragmatic control. Pragmatic control doesn't work with these mystics in their own accounts. All of them talk about how you depend on God's action. So, and also he points out the mystics are discerning and self-critical regarding their religious experience, and their accounts are to be taken in their own terms and within that sphere of evidence. The relationship of the vertical is not a matter of theorizing, but a personal relationship in which there are distinctive personal evidences, confirmations, moments of closeness, absence, and thwarted and fulfilled anticipations. But these occur in a personal relationship, that is to say, in the sphere of the heart. That's what's going on in religious experience. So when you think about it, it's not going to be like that in a way. And he does limit himself to the mystics in the Abrahamic traditions within a distinctive Heim-welt, whose inhabitants can find their experiences, he says, decisive and absolute relative to their ranking of values, but not universal. So he's going to limit himself to the Abrahamic religions. He says that those could be, I can find those decisive within my Heim-welt, and they're absolute relative to me. I find that this is an absolute value in some sense, but not universal, because I think he's worried about these other religions and doesn't want to go in that direction. And in the paper, I do try to integrate Schutzian accounts of the finite province of meaning of religious experience with Steinbach's account here. Okay, now the third part of the paper I want to look at, and this will be a little bit longer, I want to look at the personalistic theism levels of theory and anonymity. So not only do we have a distinctive object that shapes the whole sphere, but now how do you relate this finite province of meaning of religious experience with this personalistic theism? How do you integrate that? How do you theorize about it? That's kind of what I want to look at now. So first of all, the mystic accounts are a first small step away from religious experience. When the mystic sits there and says, well, I'm going to give you an account of what I just went through, that is not a self-religious experience. They've already kind of moved a little bit away from that. Schutz talks about enclaves, for instance, and I think an example of this would be, that's where you have one finite province of meaning within another one. So I think Anselm's ontological argument within a prayer is a good example of that. It's a prayer, the prosologium, but then in the middle of it, you get the ontological argument, which is philosophical. So you get a little level of theory in the middle of this. So there are enclaves like that. Vertical, and in that kind of account, the vertical religious experience is not, it's not really too anonymous. It's right there. I mean, you can, even in Anselm, you can kind of see religious experience integrated with theory. Shaler gives us an essential phenomenology of religious experience. There's a pretense, I think, to a position from above all types of religious experiences, and yet it remains tethered to personal theistic experience. And his axiology, that version of religious experience is more anonymous, but still there. So once he gives you this axiology, you can say anybody can, well, we gotta discuss what the absolute is, and that can go on with anybody. You don't have to have religious experience. Religious experience people will have certain kinds of things they think are absolute. Okay. Steinbach, limitation to the Abrahamic traditions. He teases out their philosophical implications with a delimited essence. That's what I think Steinbach's doing. He's trying to say, let's look at just the Abrahamic tradition, and let's try to tease out the philosophical implications for them. I'm not going to talk about religious experience beyond that, right? So it's a very limited, it's what I call a delimited essence is what he's kind of aiming at. Frem-dwelt, who's a psychologist, philosopher, he spelled out, shows how such psychologists, philosophers can spell out the essence of hallucination. For instance, and then you can develop qualified essences. So schizophrenic hallucination is one version. Drug-induced hallucination is another, you know. And you can do essences of those kinds of descriptions, he's arguing, within the general description. So I like it because that gives you a possibility of doing what Steinbach's doing, which I see as to just develop sort of a limited essence of the Abrahamic religion's mystic experience and not have to say this is what everybody has. Okay. But the specific kind of religious experience then becomes anonymous to different degrees and discussions of and theories about that experience. So the mystics account's very close to the experience, right? An enclave can be very close to the religious experience. Shaler's a little bit interesting. Steinbach, I think, stays close to it. But I want to argue the finite province of meaning of religious experience, which I've talked about, really gets away from concrete religious experience in some sense. It's trying to proceed at a highly general level. When one treats religious experience as a finite province of, this is from my paper, when one treats religious experience as a finite province of meaning whose governing form of spontaneity aims at any ultimate reality or relevance, one's understanding of religious experience can seem appropriate for a generalized universal semi-eidetic account of religious experience. But for the Abrahamic mystics whom Steinbach describes, it might seem as if the abstract, neutral presentation of the finite province of meaning of religious experience has failed to do justice to the intensely impersonal, imperative character of personalistic theism, and as if by its very abstractness, it has betrayed what religious experience is all about. So one of these mystics might say, this stuff that Barber's giving us here about this finite province of meaning, it falsifies what we experience. It's just so abstract. Okay, I'll come back to that. I have to give an answer to that at some point. So finally, I want to look at generative phenomenology, and this has to do with subject relativity and evidence. So what I want to suggest is instead of moving, we're going to talk about if we're in this, supposing we take this personal theistic shaped finite province of meaning, we've seen how the fact that it's personalistic theistic shapes the whole idea of the province of meaning. And now what I want to do is to say, and it shapes how we theorize about it. Let me say that because when you talk about the experience itself, it's different than theory. And then there are levels of anonymity. As theory gets more and more abstract, it becomes more and more anonymous, whatever that personal experience is. But now there's another way of looking at it. Instead of moving theoretically upward, one can move horizontally to engage other traditions of religious experience. You can do comparative studies or interreligious dialogue, which require, I think, some level of theorizing. Such an engagement shows another factor beside the specific content of religious experiences, its verticality, for instance, that distinguishes traditions, namely the generative history that phenomenology can disclose. So now what I want to do is say, let's just assume we try to talk about this personalistic theism that we've got and then go horizontally to talk with other religions. What's going to happen there? So again, the location of religious experience and its practices are in the life world, along with all kinds of other practices, according to Husserl, and he locates them within a Heim-welt, rendering them subjective relative. That's what he calls them. These are subjective relative. The philosophy can kind of aim for things that are just objective. But when you're in the life world and you're dealing with these rather concrete practices, they're going to be subjective relative. And let me read, this is where I want to insert a little reading here. Husserl, allowing for the diversity of the cultural world, shaping these accomplishments, acknowledges that truth in everyday life becomes relativized, subjective, relative in character. Part of the subjective relativity of religious experiences is that they have had their sense constituted generatively through the contributions of ancestors, through a generative history that produces a home world that other groups do not share, though they have their own home world perceived by us as alien to our own. Alien there is just going to cover Frem-dwelt. That's, I don't mean alien in a way some people talk about undocumented workers as alien in a nasty way. This is just alien, it's a different world. This generative origin reconstructed by interpretation from our present backwards is vast and never fully recoverable, as Husserl himself observes, with reference to the immense history preceding us, extending back to the origins of humanity itself and the limited possibilities of apprehending it through a Rückfrage. Husserl comments, but do we not understand, although in a certain undefined generality, an humanity on the basis of the handed down stone axes, arrowheads, and the like? And is not this understanding of the same general type as a backward understanding of labor on the basis of a liveliness? And is not this understanding of the same general type as a backwards understanding of labor on the basis of a liveliness of the producing of labor, of the planning, discovery, effectuating, doing, etc.? So I'm sorry, this sentence is too long. Is not this understanding of the same general type as it's a backward understanding of labor, all the labor that went into producing this at the end, right? She says a liveliness, which itself is wholly and fully hidden and remains forever. It's just like if you find a stone axe or an arrowhead, if there's all the labor, it's just lost. Interesting, anonymous, I think, in some sense. Without the possibility of evidence in the completion, and as he says, it's not this understanding without the possibility of evidence in the completion of such a backward understanding, meaning you can't completely, you're never going to understand completely the history that went into that before you. Okay. Hence, Matt Bauer rightly refers to this history uncovered in generative phenomenology as an immemorial past, commenting on the depth of such generatively shaped life worlds across generations. Steinbach observes, By calling an alien mythical, Husserl does not mean that its alienness is invented. Rather, he wishes to invoke an alien Frem-dwelt as having a foreign cultural or historical density. My encounter with an individual alien is simultaneously an encounter with a dense and momentous tradition that is articulated through, for example, myth, narrative, world stories. It is a dimension that we cannot simply overcome as we would disappointment or a surprise. You cannot simply overcome this huge history that you experience when you meet someone from another cultural background. Okay, I have to. So the Greeks, by the way, had an encounter with the barbarians, strove with the irrelative, moving from doxa to episteme. But philosophy too has a degenerative history. But so he does. Husserl says when the Greeks met these other religions, they started trying to reach out what's universal across these different cultures. Okay, and so, but that's not what's going to happen in the life world, and I don't think that's what's going to happen in religious experience either. I think those things are going to be in the life world and subject relative. Husserl, though, and this is what's interesting, he does not deprecate the subjective relative life world. Versus, he says, the natural sciences that cut themselves off from a long history of subjectivity, which they explain away in a different way according to the crisis. Because Husserl finds there in the everyday life world reflection, responsible refusal to succumb to passivity, a willingness to consider evidences, seek for truth, fulfillment or not. And here I can give a few more comments. Despite Husserl's move in Teleologie in der Philosophie Geschichte from practical, tradition-laden everyday life to the philosophical perspective, he nevertheless refuses to deprecate the subjective relative truths of the everyday life of doxa, as he sees the empirical sciences tending to do, exalting their own rationality as episteme over doxa conceived as blind, evidenceless, and despicably relative. The result, of course, is that the natural sciences cut themselves off from the immense domain of subjectivity that preceded them in history and that has been constitutive of their own project. All this fully in line with Husserl's critique in the crisis that the natural sciences have sought to explain away scientifically that subjectivity is merely the result of neurological brain firings. By contrast, Husserl insists that knowledge in pre-scientific humanity has a good, so to speak, noble meaning in which it has attained to truth in natural practical life for whose successful practice it is indispensable. He insists that out of this honorable, noble reason of a natural, healthy human understanding, philosophy itself was born. Indeed, Husserl traces philosophy itself genetically, generatively back to everyday life whose knowing practices anticipate those of philosophy. In everyday life, one can take up callings that have their own generative history. And one assumes critical responsibility for the beliefs one is passively absorbed. One acquires one's valid beliefs from the start through interpersonal exchanges, introduces modifications through further exchanges with others, seeks clarity and tests the simplest inductions, remains convinced that we can establish what is true or false even when obstacles block such determinations, considers whether traditionally bequeathed goals and means can be justified, examines whether beliefs achieve the fulfillment of evidence, reconsiders means and ends that may have succumbed to passive repetition and practically exploded, pursues self-correction, and in the end renders everyday practice rational. All these knowledge processes in natural, pre-scientific, and extra-scientific life are all subject relative because one is not seeking the irrelative that is the goal of philosophy. Yet, despite the subjective relativity of these extra or pre-philosophical domains, and despite the fact that very different relevances govern different domains within everyday life, Husserl, in line with his positive appropriation of this everyday life and his recognition of the many epistemological processes at work there, acknowledges a wide variety of different kinds of truth. The market, for instance, the market precisely of the free citizens of our time has its market truth. The pharmacy, its pharmacological truth. The civic life in the local area and nation of our present time, its political truth. This is common for all of us, namely raised in this well-trusted same society and the same tradition. Everyone, always related to a we, knows what works well in the marketplace and even so in other well-trusted situations. He or she knows what it is for truth and falsehood to be reasonably decided. What are the relevant or irrelevant grounds or differences for a relevant true pound in the marketplace? The difference in grams is irrelevant. For a yard, the breadth of a finger does not matter, while in the case of pharmacy, such a measure may work well. So my main point here is to just say this: relativity in the life world, outside of the parameters of philosophy, does not preclude the finding of truth. That is the fulfillment of intentional directedness. So I want to put that in religion too. I want to say religious experience is we are intentional beings, and we're getting fulfillments and all kinds of things there. But we also, and we have to ask the truth here. I'd say more, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. My computer is a university computer, and it's laden with all kinds of security measures. So it goes off as soon as you can't even get it done in a sense. So anyhow, generative phenomenology shows then that although often proceeding within subjective relative context, we are also intentional beings oriented toward fulfillments, questions, whether in the interpersonal sphere of the heart, in theistic personalist religious experience, or at various theoretical levels. Personal relationships involve fulfillments and anticipations in the realm of the heart. This person surprises me or loves me or I'm confirmed, or all that's going on with it as we deal with it. Okay, so now if you look at comparative studies and interreligious dialogue, concrete instantiations of religious experience are distinctive, not only due to the different objects and contents of the different religious experiences, such as having a personal deity, but also because of the immense generative history that has transmitted and shaped those contents across generations and can never be facilely transcended. That generativity limits our religious experiences to an inevitable subject relative framework and makes our understanding of other traditions tentative. Steinbach speaks, he says that my experience within, say, the Abrahamic traditions is decisive for me, for us, but not for them, as theirs is decisive for them, right? So they each, in this kind of, we got decisive, people are decisive. There's, as he says, an accessibility and genuine inaccessibility, an incomprehensibility, an axiological asymmetry. But even within, so I want to say that there's this kind of engagement, and certainly people come at this engagement, say from the Abrahamic traditions, and they're going to engage other traditions, and this is we're talking about subjective relative spheres, partially because this is kind of a personalistic theism, but also because of the whole generative history here on both sides, in a sense. But even within subjective relative spheres, because we are intersubjective intentional beings, there is a need to become critical of mere passive absorption, to be self-critical, and to raise questions respectfully in dialogue with others. Come back to one point I left out, and that is to say, go back to my idea that there's these levels of anonymity. I should have brought this up earlier. There's these levels of anonymity as you go up up the theoretical ladder, as it were. Likewise, the abstract account of the finite province of this is going to be, it doesn't quite fit where it should have been read. Likewise, the abstract account of the finite province of meaning of religious experience, attempting to accommodate religious experiences in general. I mean, when I'm talking about the finite province of meaning of religious experience, when you talk about something about get all experiences, right? Principally by allowing for a diversity of ultimate realities in relation to a province's form of spontaneity, would proceed at a level even farther away from the concrete religious experience of the Abrahamic mystics. But here, on a philosophical level, one is still issuing assertions about what religious experience in a semi-eidetic sense would consist in much the way that Shaler's fully eidetic account of the essential phenomenology of religion attempts to do. While it might seem that such a semi-eidetic account of the finite province of meaning of religious experience fails to do justice to the concrete account of the Abrahamic mysticism and its living vitality, this sense of failure has to do with the fact that we are dealing with different contexts and different provinces of meaning and the evidences within them. So I'm not, let me complete the book. The semi-eidetic study of religious experience as a finite province of meaning pertains to a theoretical province of meaning and is not itself the finite province of religious experience itself. Of necessity, it cannot replicate religious experience itself. These are two different things. And people confuse that. If you look at it and say, well, that just seems so abstract. You're saying that because you're not recognizing this is a theoretical province. You're talking about what you experience in that living province. And it seems discordant that way. Okay. But within the limits of these different configurations of meaning, one can find propositions about experiences that can achieve fulfillment and validation, however thin their contents may seem to be in comparison with other finite provinces of meaning. So even if the sphere of what I call the finite province of meaning religious experience, there's still questions of validity, although the content's pretty thin when you compare it to what your experience while you're actually going through religious experience itself. Okay. Okay. I left on this last section about how we would engage, how people could be engaged in religious dialogue across different traditions and what this meaning of generative phenomenology signifies for that. But I guess the final thing, even across these religious experiences, a meaning that I think we need a supplementation of epistemological limits. And so what I'd like to do is just conclude with a quote from Levinas, who really talks about the ethical limits of trying to go across these different provinces. These different religious frameworks, which again have different objects, and they also pertain to a huge generative history. Philosophy is called upon, Levinas says at the end of, toward the end of Otherwise Than Being, it is called upon to conceive ambivalence, to conceive it in several times. Even if it's called to thought by justice, it still synchronizes in the said, the diachrony of the difference between the one and the other. So the problem with philosophy is it's going to have to synchronize in the said, the diachrony of what's going on in the in saying itself. So it synchronizes in the said, the diachrony of the difference between the one and the other, and remains the servant of the same. That is the difference that signifies the difference between the one and the other as the one for the other, as non-indifference to the other. Philosophy is the wisdom of love at the service of love. Okay, thank you. Okay. 20 minutes for question, maybe 15, and then we can give it a 5-minute break for Mark to get set up. Yeah, Olga.
Mike, thank you very much. So you place religious experience in the context of generativity.
At the end of the paper.
Yeah.
Right. But of course, it's there all along, yeah.
Yes. So can you place generativity into the context of religious experience?
Well, that's
I'm
very interesting.
thinking about the first philosophy, and so how religious experience can figure into the first philosophy.
Yeah, so excellent question. Okay, so let me put it this way. So the generative phenomenology that we're talking about here, this book, actually, I'm just talking about one essay. It's about a 60-page essay that I found in the Husserliana 29, and it's a completion volume to the crisis. But there he says, here's philosophy. And unlike the natural sciences that despise the life world for its relativity and all this other stuff and think it's just, not insightful, nothing like that. He says, as a philosopher, he's starting to say, no, what you do is you find within philosophy. He says, one of the things, like, for instance, you'll find in philosophy is the calling of the philosopher. And he says, that's the kind of calling that you'll find in a house builder or in a manual laborer. They have a calling. And he shows about all these different, and then but the conclusion is, we have to say that what we've got here at philosophy was already anticipated in everyday life, right? This is part of our history as philosophers, okay? But then, like I say, he doesn't stop there, as you could hear in the quote where he says, and we have to really go back to Menstruum, right? And there we're going to find the axes and arrowheads. And at one point, actually, in that essay, he says, Kohler's apes, which means the monkeys that were practically able to decide how to knock down bananas. They preceded us in this history. He talks about children playing, these are the predecessors. These are part of our history, right? And it's by no means in philosophy, within philosophy itself, okay? So my to answer your question is, well, wasn't religion part of that experience that preceded us, right? And is there some sense in which you have to say certain kinds of religious activity were there, and we can, as a philosophers, we can look back. It's always by this kind of Rückfrage where you begin to find appresentational things when you talk about. That's interesting because they find things like vocation. They talk about the philosopher's vocation. That immediately refers into vocation in everyday life, right? Or you'll find evidences, right, in philosophy. But then you'll see, you go back and look at everyday, he'll talk about things like, in the German words are real interesting, the same words he finds in philosophy. he also finds it work in everyday life. Like for
Interesting,
instance,
yeah.
people, clarum, they want clarity about what they're doing. That's the same kind of thing you'll find in philosophy, right? And so what he's doing is finding the roots of philosophy and all this that preceded
Mhm.
us as philosophers, right? Which
Mhm.
I find this just an amazing text. I mean,
Mhm.
a matter of fact, I contrasted in the paper I was just giving with the Cartesian method.
Uh-huh.
The Cartesian method is one, to go into the phenomenological reduction, of course, is one where you kind of take a distance from everyday life, right?
Uh-huh.
And you're trying to be critical, and not accept prejudices that
Mhm.
are in pre-philosophic life.
Uh-huh.
But this is almost like an attitude of gratitude.
Mhm.
It's like saying, my God, all this stuff we inherited
Mhm.
that we never even recognized. It's a beautiful, I mean, it's a really lovely, this is the third way, it's the way through history
Interesting,
into the
yeah.
phenomenological reduction. So, I mean, but it's not, let me put it this way, it's not like the Cartesian thing has totally disappeared, because you still want to be critical of those things that you've inherited. So you'd want to be critical even if religion played some kind of role in the evolution of philosophy, you'd also want to be somewhat critical of it, but you also want to say, acknowledge the gift that came through all this history that we've got.
Mhm.
I find that this is amazing Husserl text that I thought,
Mhm. Mhm.
amazing way of conceiving phenomenology, generative phenomenology.
Yeah, very different from kind of standard version of emergent Greek philosophy through a kind of formalized wonder, taume edestai. Yeah.
He does use that though. He does talk about, that's what the Greeks, when the Greeks encountered these barbarian religions, of course, these barbarians certainly
Right,
problematic,
yeah.
but when you encounter them, he does say there's wonder, but they try to look at, is there something universal here between us? So, but even the very discovery of philosophy itself comes through an intercultural exchange
Mhm.
with these other cultures, which leads the Greeks to wonder whether there can be anything sort of irrelative, right? Which he does think that there is sort of, that's what philosophy aims at, right?
Mhm.
But he's also it's like the essay is incredible, because by the end of the essay, he comes back and starts saying, he acknowledges that the goal of philosophy is to try to come up to a definition of philosophy itself, but we're also got such different there's so much division in philosophy. He says it just, he sees the skeptic as even part of the same history. We're all trying to figure out what philosophy is itself, right?
Mhm.
So it's a kind of, he doesn't come out and say, this is philosophy, this is philosophy, but it's more like, even in history, it's more tentative. It's more, let's engage the skeptic.
Mhm.
As he says, the skeptic takes sort of a negative approach to the history of philosophy. We find that there's such disagreement that it can't be achieved. He says, where I take a positive, but they both agree that we got to look at the history and see the discord and then figure out what to make of it, right? So it's, it's interesting stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah. Neil.
Just a question about the relationship between religion as a finite province of meaning in and of itself, and then like, say, various different religious traditions or different religious life worlds. Are those also distinct finite provinces of meaning, or are they somehow nested within the finite province of meaning of religion? Are they sub-provinces of meaning? You know what I mean? Like because the finite province of meaning orients things around a certain approach to life and a certain object. And would the argument then be, those are the same in all these different religious traditions? They also, they share this orientation to an object. Or can we say each of them are distinct finite provinces of meaning, but in which case then what happens to the category of religion? Is it still helpful, or do we still need it? Or we just say, Christianity is a province of meaning, Islam is a province of meaning, Buddhism is a province of meaning, etc.
Yeah, I mean, my view would be, well, if I look up at the paper, that's a very good question. I'm trying to think, like, it does, it would seem to me, it does seem to me, you got those 6 features of the cognitive style of the finite province of meaning of religious experience. The central one, a very powerful determinant, is the form of spontaneity and what is its ultimate object. And there I just say, whether it's the ultimate reality or your ultimate relevance. So my view would say these distinctive religious experiences, say the verticality or Buddhism or something like that, would be instantiations of the finite province of meaning of religious experience. I don't want to call each one of them because then we need to have 6 different cognitive features for each province of meaning. I don't think that, so I don't want to go that way. But what I tried to do is say, but maybe that's where I moved the discussion using Fred Wurtz's idea that you can have like what Steinbach does, it seems to be sort of a study of a qualified essence. It is to say, what is the Abrahamic mystics' view of religious experience? So there he's trying to get at kind of a qualified essence. So it's kind of an interesting thing because it keeps it limited. It doesn't say this is all religious experience. This is kind of, well, here's one way of doing it, you know. So that's a good question. I guess I'm trying to accommodate the idea. I just think I call them, that's why it's so abstract. The finite provinces of meaning religious experience is pretty abstract because basically that form of spontaneity says whatever's your ultimate reality. And that could be lots of things it's like Tillich's idea of an ultimate concern or, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. Peter.
Building off Olga's question and the word tradition that Neil used, for you, is generativity itself a religious experience? And if it is, where does the power of the individual lie, right? Because if we're keepers of tradition, then we're just interchangeable, right? But it seems like Socrates began by saying, I'm a gift of God, of the God to the city, right? But also, I believe as none of my peers believe. So what is really happening here? What role does generativity or tradition play in the phenomenology of religious experience for you in this paper? Because you seem quite animated by generativity.
Yeah, I do. I like it. I find it very interesting.
What's that? What's in that for you?
Huh?
What's in that?
I guess well, the two things I like about this notion of generativity are the subjective relative, right? Which means, and that's where I think you're going to get the idea that this is a tradition. I didn't do all this stuff on my own. And even in dialogue with, say, another religion, I find like, ooh, how do I understand this other person? You just, actually, that's sort of interesting. It's even in interreligious dialogue, one discovers generativity, right? Because you come up against just as you would with someone from another culture, I'd say you're discussing with someone from another culture and just think like, I don't understand this at all. This is a whole different world. So in those interchanges, you discover that. So subjective relative, I like that. I mean, it does seem to me to take account of context, sociality. One thing interesting, I was playing with this. I mean, I'm wondering whether that might be a good reason for speaking about religious experience rather than spirituality. Because religious experience ties you into this history, these traditions, these institutions that are across centuries, right? So that may be a reason to think that way. But with the subjective relativity that Husserl's got here is also this idea of not being absorbed passively and being reflective and thinking and being responsible. That I think is a key issue here. So much like Husserl himself then means, say, like in Cartesian meditations at the very beginning in the introduction where he says, at some point in your life, you have to just be as responsible as you can and decide what you take to be true here and deal with it in some ways. And my suggestion would be, there's the root of my individuality, my responsibility to evaluate what a tradition gives me. And not just take it passively, which I think those people who, for instance, would kind of fend off any idea of interreligious dialogue, say because they're skeptic about the possibility, then you run the risk of just being sort of passively taken over by a tradition, your own tradition in some sense, which I think would be problematic. The interesting thing is, what I found interesting too in Steinbach's account, is almost all the mystics, those mystics that I mentioned here, they're almost all heretics in their own tradition. Every one of them. Priest of Avila was brought before the Inquisition. I mean, these people were sort of heretical, even though they're right in the tradition, and they're kind of, so it does strike me that combination that Husserl sees of generativity involving sort of subject relative, history, intersubjectivity, we inherit all this stuff, and yet my own, that I love that he does not take that subjective relativity to rule out like fulfillment of intuitions, testing, all this other stuff. Both of those have to kind of go on. And it seems to me that's where you're going to get your autonomy and your personal dignity out of that too. Aside from, I suppose, within the Shaler is going to always do this stuff about that. The reason the personal really gets to be sort of an absolute kind of thing. And therefore the individual human person also holds the rank of sort of absoluteness. And it's absoluteness not as by God we're better, got the absolute truth, but I'm accountable to this, right? This is something, when you've got something personal filling this realm, it's something that places me in question. Like Levinas, maybe. Yeah, you were next, and I'll get you to you next.
Yeah, so I noticed that you explicitly brought up, well, not much generativity like you've just been talking about, but also flow and bliss, well, which made me think about the works of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Joseph Campbell, and Martin Seligman, and I wonder if you've just thought about or come across anything connecting what you're talking about now to their positive psychologies.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. Let me put it this way. I'd like to put that question really in terms of finite provinces of meaning, because I think all provinces of meaning have a reduced tension of consciousness compared to pragmatic everyday life. Pragmatic everyday life is where you're trying to dominate and control the world that you live in, right? And make sure you make it across the street, get up to eat breakfast, and go to your job and do the kinds of things you're doing in a job. So those are all pragmatic activities. And so the tension of consciousness is wide awakeness, okay? So then, so what Shaler's saying is in the religious province, bliss is not something, there's levels of value, right? And the lowest level is sort of this pragmatic mastery of objects. Like he says, the problem in the Byzantine law, the problem is we take vacations in order to work harder, right? That's a subversion of values. That's a subversion of values. You're taking life values, like I want to get a vacation and revitalize myself, but that's subordinated to getting a job done. So Shaler sees that as an inversion of values. But then to go up the level, there's higher levels, and then at bliss, it is just something you can't control. It's a gift. And so these levels of value work that way. But so then I would say that's because we're no longer in the pragmatic, really the pragmatic province of meaning might be confined to that lowest level of values. But all the stuff you're talking about, any province of meaning, play is a matter of letting go of pragmatic dominance. Now, to some extent, you have to kind of manage your movements in play, right? That's going on. But the idea is you take risks, right? The idea is imagination. Like I use the example of basketball, and it's something I've written, where the whole point is responsiveness to other persons as quickly as you can, relying on passive syntheses, a lot of passive syntheses to do that. And what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow is just that too. It seems to me it's kind of letting go of it's where creativity comes from, right? It's like kind of like playfulness, letting go of control, domination, mastery of situations. To let yourself be overtaken by a kind of a flow of activity that you can't actually control, as in play. I think a basketball game is like you cannot, and really I don't think honestly I've argued, I don't think the point of play is not dominance really, it's to produce a kind of a work of art. Like a basketball game is a real work of art, where we work together to produce this wonder. Even if we lose, if we played a good game, the point's not winning so much. At least there's a lot of different anthropologists have talked about other cultures, especially gatherers, and stuff like that. Point's not to win. Point is this intersubjective experience together of what we're doing. So play then is like ritual too, in a lot of ways, right? So what I'd say is I like what Csikszentmihalyi and people like that talk about. I need to get the names of the other people you mentioned, but it does seem to me that there is a kind of letting go of pragmatic dominance that is typical of a finite province of meaning, other than pragmatic everyday life. Yeah.
I wanted to kind of follow up to the statement in response to Neil about there being the one province of meaning in different religions with different instantiations. And I kind of wanted to ask if ultimate reality as an object can be known, but as a person can be unknown at the same time.
Say that again. So if ultimate reality,
As an object can be known, at least to a certain degree, but as a person can be unknown, and that may be a sort of differentiating.
can you give me an example of that?
I think of actually kind of Paul and Acts with the altar to the unknown God, and the story kind of behind it where there's this big sickness. They sacrifice to a whole bunch of gods, nothing happens, they're still plagued, and then they start offering to unknown gods because they have the sense that there must be something out there, some ultimate reality, but they don't know who it is, and they admit it. But they decide to sacrifice to it anyway, and Paul plays on this, saying, I'm revealing this God to you. It's the Christian God, of course. Are there sometimes, is sometimes a difference of instantiation the result of kind of trying to figure out who the person is, even if you have a sense of what the object is?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, other religious, traditions would certainly not have persons in that ultimate reality, right? So here again, I think the generative approach is going to come in. And if you'd like to go to Paul in Athens, it would seem to me maybe there's a whole generative tradition why we've got these different gods, and then maybe in some kind of interreligious dialogue, that's what Paul's actually trying to do. It's an interreligious dialogue in which he's trying to say, but you've got, maybe it's something like Shaler saying there's an absolute there. And we can talk about whether what you've got is really the absolute, right? Or if there's need for clarification on that kind of process, right? That's a key thing for Shaler, I think, is that the idea of the absolute can be filled. It's an absolute sphere that can be filled with things that are not absolute. And he lists things like Don Juan's sexual exploits or nationalism, right? He listens, it's interesting, nationalism as something that people have used to fill the absolute sphere. And it's incorrect. I mean, he thinks that leads to slavery and a lot, and that's his argument. So this is kind of almost independent of religious experience. What really is the absolute? And have you put something in that place that's going to be really destructive and enslaving? That could be one version of this, I think. But I also think maybe the other version is, I'm really cautious when you start doing this across religions. It's easy to do that maybe with the Greek gods and say, yeah, but this is the real God you're worshiping. I don't want to do that with other religions. I think there you got such a generative history and things like that it's just very different, right?
Yeah.
There's something ultimate. But I wouldn't be coming in and saying, well, the ultimate's really the person of God. I mean, that just strikes me as there's too much generative history. But let me put it this way. But the beautiful thing about Husserl's point here, though, is that there is discourse about it, right? That we should talk about it, right? And Paul does that. I mean, Paul's trying to say, well, I think these gods that you've got here maybe are not the real God, So he's trying to talk about what they put in the absolute sphere. What is the ultimate reality? And there's a room there for discourse, I think. But it does strike me, boy, when you do that across traditions of religion that have existed for centuries, that's pretty difficult. And other than to approach it with something, this is something I can learn from, and exchange on, and perhaps I don't know whether you could raise questions about across religious traditions. I mean, you could ask whether Catholicism is too much dominated by authoritarianism or something, right? And you hope someone else would enter into a dialogue and bring that up from another religious perspective with a long historical tradition. For instance, I'm just thinking off the top of the head.
Hi. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I just want to first follow up on what you said and then ask a question. Regarding what you like about generativity, there is a very nice letter of Husserl to the priest Badim, where he says that he actually explored his phenomenology for those people like him that don't have this talent for belief.
Husserl said that.
Husserl said that. I can give you the exact reference. And I think it is, and also there is at certain point was translated the conversation with the sister Castilla that was looking after him when he was on his deathbed, and she recorded, and it seems that obviously the situation of being on the twilight of your life is something that generates specific influences, but it was quite tensed about this aspect of religion and its connection to his phenomenology. He not at all liked the fact that many of his disciples converted to other religions, obviously those from Judaism to Christianity and others, and he was very critical about that, very tensed about that. So I think in a way, I wonder, I also, I'm convinced about what you said about this generativity, but it seems like he kind of came into a point that he reconciled the impossibility of the project of phenomenology as streng Wissenschaft, and he eventually understood that this is impossible. So he turned to this sphere of the life world, where it has many, many advantages, but the question is what is the uniqueness of the religious experience within that sphere? Because the very constitution of this distinct sphere of religious experience is its distinctness from the life world. It's the separation from the life world. It's being not part of the everyday life. So at the expense of integrating this religious experience and having a discourse on that, on the divine, we kind of lose the uniqueness and the very essence of this experience. I mean, the intuitive meaning of that experience.
Well, okay, thank you. Yeah, 2 points. Just
Yes,
if
yes,
I've got
yes. I
your
mean,
question.
just, obviously, it raises other question if there is any superiority of the religious experience over other experiences. If it gives us better understanding of the world, of ourselves, of reality, anything compared to other experiences, being that given its specific and distinguished aspect, characteristic of the religious experience, does it possess any advantage over other experiences, human experiences? There are many questions because this integrated, this placing it within this generative realm, it has its own, I believe, consequences, aspect that we should discuss, because it's not just
Yeah, so on the one hand, he wants to say that.
I just want to, if you can respond to this.
Yeah, so on the one hand, I mean, he does call religious experience, he puts it with other cultural practices in the life world. That's what he wants to say. It's subjective relative, therefore, I think. Okay, so he does seem to admit, though, that there's a distinctive kind of intuition that's possible here of religious experience. So he does seem to want to have that. I'm using Schutz here to try to talk about what I'm trying to say. Okay, so this is a practice in the life world. What's its particular kind of, what makes it distinctive? What makes it distinctive from music? What makes it distinctive from play? It is from all those perspectives. I think it's different. It does seem to me that it has some kind of notion of what's the ultimate reality, and there's a relationship to that. Therefore, it's different from pragmatic everyday life. It exercises a critical capacity with reference to everyday life, right? And so that's what's interesting. Maybe if I talk about Schutz,
Yes.
he's putting all these provinces of meaning in the life world, but then there's a critique of pragmatic everyday life that's coming from these provinces of meaning, like play and music. But I also say religious experience can certainly bring up a powerful critique of pragmatic everyday life. So maybe I've got more of a division there with Schutz. The other project, of course, is that Husserl, in his philosophical writings at the end, there was doing this whole monadology and the idea that everything's ethically oriented towards some ultimate goal where he thinks it's God. You know, in some sense, that's kind of the goal there. So yeah, I guess I'm just gonna say, and, oh yeah, and then the other thing is, it's not, the generativity is not just that it's all part of the life world and it all comes from the past, but that it's got within it distinctive forms of criticism and interaction, right? So what makes religious experience distinctive is it maybe engages the world because even within itself, there's this process of I'm an intentional being in relationship to others. And so it's a critical part of a tradition. That's what's both sides of it. And so then it seems to me it also has that relationship to the rest of the life world, right? It's also going to engage critically the rest of the life world from out of its own resources, just like you do with other religions, just like you do with, within your own religion, as a matter of fact, because that's who we are. We're intentional beings, always checking and testing and trying to learn from other people because we're not just going to accept things passively. So I wouldn't accept just passively what pragmatic everyday life is. And Schutz doesn't want that either. I mean, I think there's play exercises a critique over against everyday life, right? Music does, right? Music for Schutz really.
What would be the special critique of religious experience regarding compared to these other experiences included within the life world?
Right, you can do that. You can say what's the difference, and also with learning, right? I mean, I think play, music, and religious experience have a lot to learn from each other, but also there's going to be critique. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're out of time. I just about ruined my computer.